Pleasure to welcome to the program Professor of Economics at Samuel Du Bois Cook, Distinguished Professor of Public Policy at Duke, author of From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, William Sandy Darity. Welcome to the program. I'm here with Emma Vigland.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's start with what we have in terms of a racial wealth gap. I mean, the massive disparity that exists in this country between white people and black people when it comes to wealth. And we have one obviously in the context of income too, but wealth is really sort of, I think, the key marker. There are multiple ways of assessing it. Will you walk through the different ways that we hear people calculate this disparity and the one that you used and why?
Well, I'd like to start by saying that it's really important that we make a distinction between wealth and income, where income is a flow of resources, usually measured in a year's time, that's largely associated with what people earn. In contrast with wealth, which is the difference between what you own and what you owe, or the net value of your personal property, which could be inclusive of real estate for residential or non-residential purposes, retirement funds, business ownership, stocks and bonds, or various types of financial assets. And so that's a critical distinction at the outset. And wealth is, as you suggest, a more significant or important indicator of economic security and opportunity, because wealth can replace lost income. If you have an emergency that results in a decline in your income, like a loss of a job or a medical emergency that confronts your family, if you're wealthier, you're much better able to weather the storm. Now, how do we measure it, and how do we compare the amounts that blacks and whites have in the United States?
We measure it. Can I just ask you one more question about what constitutes wealth? Social Security and pensions. How is that calculated into wealth? Because this is where income will determine. Your income will determine your Social Security payments to some extent, and your pension as well. How is that calculated in the context of wealth? I mean, money that.
Yes, absolutely. It's in the context of your retirement funds.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Appreciate that. I just wanted to double check on that. Now continue. I apologize.
Sure. No, it's an important question. So the way in which we measure people's wealth is by measuring the difference between the assets that they hold and the degree of debt that they hold. And if we're thinking about blacks and whites in the United States, the gulf between black and white wealth is driven much more heavily by differences in assets than differences in debt. The differences between black held assets and white held assets is much wider than the difference between black debt indebtedness and white indebtedness. There are two ways we typically measure the amount of wealth that is held by a community, adjusting for community size. One way is to look at the households that are in the very middle of the distributions for each community. And we refer to this as the measure of wealth based upon the median. And the difference in wealth based upon the median is approximately about $164,000 per black or white household. On the other hand, the other way we can compute the gap in wealth is by looking at the average difference between black and white households, and that's a substantially larger gap. That's approximately $840,900 in net worth between the mean black household and the mean white household. Frequently, people say they prefer to look at the median because it omits folks who are outliers, folks who have extremely high levels of wealth, and folks who have extremely low levels of wealth. But I argue that in the context of thinking about the black-white wealth differential, we have to address the mean or the average. And this is because of two considerations. The first is 97% of the wealth that is held by all white households is held by white households with a net worth above the white median.
Actually, well, that let me just that beeper. I did not set that off, but that is a good opportunity for me to just step in and just make that clear to folks that the wealth is so concentrated in this country that, and we see this actually. I mentioned this in the context of often like how much less of income we're capturing under Social Security because of this dynamic.
Yes.
That so much of the wealth. Let's just, for the sake of making it clear, Bezos and Elon Musk and a couple of these guys own so much of the number of dollars that are floating around out there that the wealth is above that median. The all the wealth captured is above that median.
Yes, only 3% of white wealth is held by households at the median or below for white households. But it's not just because of these extremely rich billionaires, a handful of them, although there are a handful of extremely rich billionaires, but 25% of white households have a net worth in excess of $1 million, and it's only 4% of black households. So if we were to ignore the wealth that was held above the white median, we would be taking the vast majority of wealth off the table for consideration.
And how much of home ownership is central to understanding the concentration of wealth as well? I mean, that would be in terms of asset accumulation, probably one of the largest factors that drives this dynamic for and how it continues.
So it's certainly very important for households that are closer to the middle of the distribution. But when we start talking about households that are in the upper 30 to 25% of the wealth distribution, then the share of their assets that's attributable to a primary residence becomes considerably smaller. And if we were to look at the average across all households, a primary residence constitutes maybe about 25% of the assets that households possess. So the remainder is retirement accounts, business ownership, stocks and bonds, and non-residential real estate also, which is very, very important.
I'm just trying to work my way around the mean, where 97% of the wealth is held outside of that mean.
No, it's above the median, above the middle.
The median. Okay. And yet we should use the mean as the mechanism. Is that it to determine the actual disparity?
Yeah. So another way to think about it is Black American descendants of persons enslaved in the United States are about 12% of the nation's population, but possess less than 2% of the nation's wealth. So if we set as a target bringing the Black share of wealth into consistency with the Black share of the population, it would require us to simultaneously target the gap in wealth at the mean. If we were to target the gap at the median, we would not approach eliminating the racial wealth gap in the sense of making the Black share of wealth compatible or consistent with the Black share in the population.
And the goal here isn't, and maybe this is just semantics and it's just perspective, but the goal isn't necessarily to achieve parity for parity's sake. The argument is that there have been events, mechanisms over the course of the past 200, 300, 400 years, which have led to that disparity. And so it's really, we are addressing the infractions that took place to create that disparity rather than a vision of every racial group or different cohort in the United States should have an equal amount of income, right? I mean, it is.
Yeah.
That may
No,
be.
no, that's exactly right. In our book From Here to Equality, Kirsten Mullen and I argue that the real starting point for the case for reparations that should be directed at the federal government is 1776, with the formation of the new country as an independent nation. Some people say, well, you really should start at 1789 because that's when the Constitution was fully adopted. Fine. If you want to start there, that's okay with us also. The key point is that there's a set of federal policies that have been pursued that promoted white wealth accumulation and led to Black wealth decumulation. And so it's because of public policies that were intentionally designed to craft or create the Black-white wealth gap that we think that that's the appropriate target. It's not a general principle that we should always have intergroup equality over all facets of life. It's because this particular inequality was the consequence of public policy. And it begins with the failure to provide the formerly enslaved with the 40-acre land grants that they were promised as restitution for their years of bondage, a promise that was eliminated and reversed by Lincoln's successor after Lincoln was murdered, Andrew Johnson. In addition, at the same time, the federal government was in the process of providing 160-acre land grants to 1.5 million white families in the Western territories as the nation completed its colonial settler project. These were lands that had been occupied previously by indigenous people, and they're distributed virtually free of charge to 1.5 million white families, leading to a situation where today approximately 45 million living white Americans are beneficiaries of those Homestead Act land grants. So while Black Americans were promised 40 acres, 1/4 of the 160 acres, but then got nothing, white Americans got these substantial land patents in the West. And then during the Jim Crow period, we had a successive wave of massacres, beginning at the end of the Civil War, carrying into the 1940s, white massacres that resulted in the loss of Black lives, but also, with respect to the wealth gap, led to the destruction and or appropriation of Black-owned property by the white terrorists. And then in the 20th century, the federal government moves its wealth or asset building processes away from land acquisition to home ownership. And even then, there's a discriminatory application of those laws in such a way that whites enter into the middle class as a consequence of the Federal Housing Administration's policies as well as the GI Bill, while Blacks are disproportionately denied access to that same middle class position. So the wealth gap is something that was created by public policy, and hence public policy should be mobilized for the purposes of reversing.
And we should say that that's the abridged version, right? I mean, we have, I mean, we can also go and talk about those same massacres that were also attacking the political power of
That's correct.
Black people during Reconstruction, which ultimately leads to more decisions, cascading a series of decisions that will also disaccumulate wealth for Black people and accumulate wealth for white people. We've spoken to Annalisa Cox about her book Bone and Sinew, about 10,000 Black farmers in what was then the Northwest territories, Ohio and that area in the, I think it was the 1830s, where laws were passed to basically strip these Black farmers of their land. We could go on and on.
Yeah, I mean, states like Oregon literally could be described as sundown states because they had laws that excluded the entry of Black people into the state.
And I guess one could also argue that the there's a knock-on effect to those 160 acres and to, you know, the resources that people as you go.
I'm sorry, you handled that so beautifully the first time. I don't know. I think they're testing the
Fire alarm.
testing the alarm system at my home.
Oh, I thought that was when you thought I got something particularly right.
No.
Particularly wrong, to be
Or
honest.
particularly wrong.
I don't have a buzzer at my desk.
All right, so the if we get to that point where we, like, at what point how do we start to delineate between, and maybe this is splitting hairs, but I think, you know, this ultimately we start getting into the realm of, like, you know, the political implications of this, but when do we stop looking at the implications of black decumulation of wealth or white accumulation of wealth that are a part of the same lineage of slavery versus, let's say, like FHA loans in World War, you know, in the 50s and the 40s, or the GI Bill, or we spoke to Dorothy Brown the other day about the tax code. Like, that would impact maybe folks who don't have descendants of slaves. I mean, what is there any point? Because, I mean, I think, like, it seems to me this lineage of wealth decumulation for black people continues today, right? I mean, this isn't necessarily historical. I think there was a report that just came out a couple of weeks ago that showed black boys will necessarily, as adults, if you look at black boys and and white boys as children, regardless of where they live, there'll be a wealth disparity between them 20 or 30 years out. And so this has been ongoing. At what point is there a cutoff in terms of, like, when we're talking about reparations and move into, like, just a sort of, we have inequalities in society that we need to deal with? Like, at what point are the reparations like temporally for?
Yeah, well, so I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I mean, I certainly think that there's a host of inequalities in the society that lead to disadvantages for large numbers of people, whether they are black, white, Asian, or Latino. And those are disadvantages that need to be corrected. And so, as a consequence, I'm an advocate of a set of policies that come under the label of an economic bill of rights for the 21st century, which would be inclusive of things like a federal job guarantee, national health insurance, and so forth. But there is an outstanding debt that has never been paid to Black Americans as a consequence of the failure to meet the promise of 40 acres at the end of the Civil War. And that's a community that merits specific consideration with respect to American national policy. And so I think we do both is my position, but they are not the same policies. A policy of reparations for Black Americans that addresses the racial wealth gap is something that's quite distinct from a set of policies that are universally applicable to all Americans, because not all Americans have experienced the cumulative multi-generational effects of white supremacy.
And I guess that's the part I'm asking about, is in terms of, like, who is qualified for that narrow set of what we call reparations. Is that specifically descendants of slaves? Or is it expanded, or is it a different group of people?
So in the work that we've done, there's been a specific focus on Black Americans who are descendants of persons who were enslaved in the United States. And that's because that's the community that has had to bear the burden of the cumulative effects of slavery, legal segregation in the United States, and then ongoing atrocities like mass incarceration, police executions of unarmed blacks, sustained discrimination in employment, housing, and credit markets. What I'd like to emphasize is that in the present moment, there's approximately 45 million Black people in the United States, 10% of whom are immigrants of more recent origin in the United States. And the vast majority of those, upwards of more than 9% of those, are individuals whose families arrived after the passage of the Civil Rights Acts, and then more specifically, post 1980 or so. So we're talking about a very, very small number of folks who are not descendants of persons who were enslaved in the United States, who were living in the United States during the Jim Crow years. And so I think the focus has to be on those folks whose ancestors came here enslaved, rather than other folks who might have come here under different circumstances. We can distinguish, I think, in an important way between involuntary and voluntary immigrants.